episode 10 of Is This a Great Game or What? With the Hall of Famer Tim Kurkjian. I'm Jeff Kurkjian, and this is our Memorial Day episode. As we know, as Americans, Memorial Day, we get the day off in order to remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice serving our great country.
Right, and 12 Major League players died serving our country. And today we're also going to celebrate those who served, thousands of Major League players who served and survived. We will talk about the heroes for our military and in Major League Baseball.
And it's really special because our guest today is the granddaughter of Yogi Berra, 10 World Series wins, a Hall of Famer, one of the greatest catchers of all time. But as we learned from Lindsay, his military career was more important than anything he ever did on the field. And trust me, Lindsay is so incredibly talented. She's a journalist. She's immersed in her grandfather's life and legacy. We're so excited for her to join the show.
Which is why I'm wearing my Yogi shirt today. And if you can notice here, the G is number 8, which of course was Yogi's number. Greatest 8 of all time, Cal Ripken, Yogi Berra, Joe Morgan, Carl Yastrzemski. Make up your own mind. Woo! Really good group at 8.
We'll have to go Ozzy to Oral another time. But so that is in store. We've got more on Memorial Day and military service in Major League Baseball. But before we get there, let's get our takeaways from the week in Major League Baseball.
Well, first off, Jeff, we need to explain we're shooting this.
This is true.
We are shooting this from West Virginia at our cabin. I never get Memorial Day off because it's an enormously important baseball celebration. But I took the time to be with the family. We came to our cabin in West Virginia. West Virginia, of course, has a very rich history in baseball. Bill Mazeroski, who I believe is the greatest defensive second baseman of all time. Trust me, Jeff, when I tell you this. Hall of Famer Bill Mazeroski. Nobody made the double play better than he did. And what he did, he stood right on second base. And he told the runner, go ahead, try to get me. You're going to have to go through these thick, stocky legs. No one made the turn better than Bill Mazeroski. And of course, our dear friend John Kruk is also from West Virginia. Krucky has made me laugh a million times. And with all of Krucky, his stories begin with, Tim, did I ever tell you the time about that and then it always turns into this ridiculous story.
Right, you never know where he's going to go.
He said once, he said, Tim, did I ever tell you about the time I shot a deer in the hot tub? And, with Krucky, you have to ask Krucky, were you in the hot tub? Was the deer in the hot tub? Were both of you in the hot tub? So he said, no, I was a senior in high school in West Virginia. I got my shotgun leaned up against my jacuzzi. And then he looks at me and he pauses like, I'm now going to say, yeah, Krucky, that's where I keep my shotgun.
Everybody has one.
Who doesn't have one? And he said he stood up, shot a deer buck naked out of the jacuzzi, sat down. That's John Kruk's story growing up in West Virginia.
Yeah, and so if you're listening, wherever you listen, thank you so much. If you hear birds chirping or any sort of sounds kind of out of my control, because I'm the one who edits all this together, it's because we're filming this outside because we have 3 of my dad's grandchildren inside of the house making a ruckus. So we are in about 90% humidity on a back porch right now. And if you watch on YouTube as well, you can see the beautiful setting behind us. So you're right. We talked West Virginia. Let's talk takeaways from the week in baseball.
All right, well, the Yankees, Jeff, are really, really good. We knew they'd be better offensively, but their pitching has been, historically good for the Yankees. For a 12-game period, their starters' ERA was under 1. Wow. And we just didn't see the Luis Gil, who has been absolutely tremendous to go with everyone else in that rotation. Plus, Aaron Judge has gotten really hot. He had more extra base hits in May than any Yankee since Joe DiMaggio had 31 extra base hits in May in 1937. The other team that is for real, I am convinced now, are the Kansas City Royals. The Royals lost 106 games last year, but they are really playing well. They've upgraded their starting rotation, and they're really starting to score some runs. In fact, they scored 7 or more runs in 6 consecutive games, which is a club record. And Bobby Witt Jr., of course, leading the way through all of that. Ketel Marte of the Diamondbacks is a real good player. And every time I see him, he gets even better. He just finished a 21-game hitting streak, and he's a switch hitter, and from the right side, he's hitting close to 400. That's how good he's been, and that's why the Diamondbacks are still in on this. And, of course, your boy, Ranger Suarez, your wife Emily's favorite player, just finished a stretch where he, in 10 starts, went 9-0 with a 1.36 ERA. The only two pitchers in Major League history who've been 9-0 with a sub 1.50 ERA are Juan Marichal and Hoyt Wilhelm. Hoyt Wilhelm was a great knuckleball pitcher, so this is a true story. This is awful. I had to do a story on knuckleball pitchers. So this is 30 years ago, long before cell phones. I call Hoyt Wilhelm on the phone. He says, call me at 7 o'clock. So I call him in his hotel room at 7 o'clock, and he's not there. I called like every 15 minutes until 10:30 at night. And finally, he answered the phone at 10:30, and he started screaming at me. You told me you were going to call me at 7 o'clock. And I said, Hoyt, I called you every 5 minutes from 7 o'clock on. I called the front desk and said, what happened here? And the front desk said, oh, we have two Hoyt Wilhelms staying at the hotel. That's impossible. Two Hoyt Wilhelms? It's a unique name. That's unfortunately my Hoyt Wilhelm story.
Oh, my goodness. What are the chances? All right, let's get into our game changer of the week. This is a player, a team, a manager, whoever it might be, who is just displaying an extra level of something great.
Right. The Cleveland Guardians are really good, way better than we thought they'd be. And Stephen Vogt, their first-year manager, having never managed anywhere in his life and a coach in the major leagues for 1 year, has been the difference. He is obsessively observant, according to Elliot Johnson, one of his former teammates. I talked to a dozen of his former teammates, and they said, we all knew the minute he got the job, he would be really good at this. Not just because he's so observant, because he's the greatest people guy you'll ever meet, one of the great communicators I've ever seen. And Max Muncy, a former teammate of his with the A's, told me, before Stephen Vogt ever managed a game, trust me, he is on the way to the Hall of Fame as a manager.
Wow.
That's how much he thinks of Stephen Vogt.
Well, it's really interesting, and I wanted to ask you just kind of, do you think it would be easier to follow a manager like Terry Francona, a legendary manager who's on his way to the Hall of Fame as well? Or, no offense, but is it easier to follow maybe someone who had poor performance?
It's impossible to follow Tito Francona because there is no following him. He's a Hall of Fame manager and one of the great personalities of all time. But Mike Chernoff, their general manager for the Guardians, told me within 5 minutes of the first interview that we did with Stephen Vogt, we knew that he had a chance to be a great manager. 5 minutes, that's all it took.
Let's get into the Kurkjians right now, and I want to appreciate and send some love to everybody who's sent their own in at greatgameorwhat.com. Dad, we have a couple here, right?
Freddie Freeman hit another grand slam. That's 6 grand slams that he's hit since the 2021 season.
Wow.
Okay? Now, the kicker is he had no grand slams in his first 250 homers. And he said, the whole team's in on it. When I finally hit one, I'm going to get a beer shower, I'm sure, which of course he did. So he had 0 for 250 homers and now has 6 in the last 3 years. That's what Freddie Freeman has done. Don Mattingly, by the way, holds the major league record for grand slams in a season with 6. And they're the only 6 grand slams he ever hit in his career. And he hit them all in the 1987 season. And it's like Frank Robinson with the Orioles, one of the great Orioles ever, hit 2 grand slams in his 6 years with the Orioles. And he hit them both in the same game.
Oh, my gosh.
Think about that. There are a million beautiful grand slam notes, okay? All right, so Ronald Acuna Jr., the reigning MVP in the National League, had his first 2 RBI game of the season, after 47 games without a multi-RBI game. And this guy drove in over 100 runs last year. So I had Frank at the Elias check for me. The only 2 players who had a 100 RBI season and then went more than 47 games the next season without a multi-RBI game were Bobby Bonds. He had a 48-gamer, and Alfonso Soriano's the all-time record holder with 55. Wow. 100 RBIs 1 year, 55 games into the next season. Still no 2 RBI games. That's hard to believe. And Acuna Jr. is going to finish this season with only 1 multi-RBI game because he's got a torn ACL. He is out for the season. This is another crushing blow for the Braves, who've had offensive troubles, and I think this changes the look of the National League East. Phillies totally in control, and now the Braves are going to have to figure out what to do without the reigning NL MVP for the rest of the year. All right, Jeff, I check every day the 4 strikeout games that go on in the big leagues, like an individual 4 game. I don't know why I do it. I'm fascinated by it. So Mike Yastrzemski, really good young player. He had his 6th 4 strikeout game of his career the other day. So I checked, did Carl Yastrzemski ever have a 4 strikeout game? His famous grandfather, who played almost 25 years, he never had a 4 strikeout game. Just showing you what pitching our guys are seeing today. It's the most difficult pitching environment in the history. So also, Ellie De La Cruz, who's a spectacular shortstop for the...
Incredible.
He has now got 7 4 strikeout games in his career, and he's only 2 years into his career. He's got 7 4 strikeout games already. And Giancarlo Stanton this year, I can't believe I missed this 2 weeks ago. Giancarlo Stanton struck out 4 times in the game for the 28th time in his career. That is a major league record. He passed 2 weeks ago. He passed Ryan Howard on the all-time list. So Omar Narvaez is a catcher for the Mets. And Elliot Johnson, the same Elliot Johnson who I quoted about Stephen Vogt, told me the other day, Tim, you never, ever, ever run on the catcher. It's never the catcher's fault. He was dead serious. You run on the pitcher every single time. So let's give Narvaez a break. But his first 32 stolen bases attempts against him were all successful. 0 for 32. We went back to at least 1961, and we couldn't find any catcher whose first 32 steal attempts against him to start a season were all successful. That's pretty hard to do.
That's when you got to look at yourself and think, oh, what am I doing? I know it's on the pitcher, but you got to be thinking to yourself, there's something wrong here.
All right, Kyle Schwarber, who you love, had 10 walks in a 3-game period. 10 walks. So 3 years ago, it happened one other time. But the only other guy who's had 10 walks in a 3-game stretch, 3 straight games, is guess who? Kyle Schwarber. So the only guy who's done it before Kyle Schwarber was Kyle Schwarber. All right. So the Marlins won a game the other day, 1-0. Jazz Chisholm hit a home run to start the game, and they won the game 1-0. So it's the first game in the history of the Marlins that they got a first-inning home run and won the game 1-0. Marlins have been around since 1997. And the last one, Jeff, and I'm a little bit disappointed, Zach Short plays for the Braves. He's a backup third baseman filling in for several people on the Braves. And he was they were playing the Cubs, and Luke Little pitches for the Cubs. So we came like 2 batters away from having a Little versus Short matchup. It's going to happen this year, Jeff. I'm going to root for it. It's going to happen, I promise.
Well, I mean, that's what we're hoping for because we love those fun names between the two. On this date in baseball, obviously, this is our Memorial Day episode, and we're really looking forward to chatting with Lindsay Berra, granddaughter of Yogi Berra, talking about his service and his legacy now. But what do you have on this date?
Well, in 1956, the year I was born, Dale Long of the Pirates hit a home run in 8 consecutive games. That was the major league record at the time, has since been tied by Don Mattingly and Ken Griffey Jr. Dale Long hit 132 major league home runs, and yet in one season, he hit a home run in 8 consecutive games. And Dale Long also caught a little bit, and he's left-handed. So he's filled with all these. And I'm still amazed by this. Speaking of Short versus Little, okay? I was positive that Chris Short, Phillies pitcher mostly from the 60s, must have faced Dale Long. Short versus long, and they never faced each other. Just another time where baseball disappoints you just a little bit. All right, birthdays today also, Jeff. We have happy 67th birthday to Kirk Gibson, one of my favorite players that I ever watched. And, of course, he won the MVP in 1988 with the Dodgers, Jeff, and he never made an all-star team. He never played in an all-star game, but was the MVP of the league. Think about that. Think about how weird that is. And last, we have happy 58th birthday to Mike Maksudian. He played a few years in the major leagues. Armenian, like you, like me. So Mike Maksudian was a funny, funny guy. And to entertain his teammates, he would occasionally eat a live bug, like a live cricket or a live cicada or something like that. He would eat live insects in order to make his teammates laugh. He was a decent little player, but that was his claim to fame. He was Armenian, and he would eat a cricket live.
You know, for me, having an Armenian last name, I've been told by Armenians that we pronounce our last name incorrectly.
No, we're saying it the way we were taught to say it.
Right.
Most people would say Kurkjian. But
yeah.
We run it together, and it's Tim Kurkjian, Jeff Kurkjian. Those are the rules.
When you have to explain, I know you probably have to do this less often than I do, but when you have to explain to like an airport staff member or somebody on the line, how do you explain? Because I always say Kirk Gin, Captain Kirk, and the gin you drink.
Right.
Do you have a way that you tell people how to explain it?
I just say it's 2 syllables. Kirk
2 syllables.
Gin. That's it. You can't miss it. But most people do.
It's time for It's in the Cards, and let's rip it. We're going to open up some Topps baseball cards and talk about each one that comes out. Adley Rutschman. Oh, so good.
Right. He's a great young player. You know, the Orioles just got swept the other day. They had gone 106 consecutive series in the regular season without being swept, and there was all exactly when Adley Rutschman showed up. It's not a coincidence that they stopped being swept as soon as he showed up. It's the 3rd longest streak in history. That guy's a really good player and really a good right-handed hitter this year. Good switch hitter, but much better now from the right side.
Look at you throwing in a cork gin during It's in the Cards. That's a great stat there. I mean, that's a very impressive streak for the Orioles. Okay, Rafael Devers with a... Dad, do you know what that light is that's in front of him? Do you know what that's called? Here, take a look.
No.
So this is what influencers on Instagram use. It's a light that's in the shape of a...
circle.
So it's called a ring light, but we'll go with that. Circle light.
Well, Rafael Devers, one of the best hitters in the game and has been for years, just hit a home run in 6 consecutive games. That is a Boston Red Sox record. Next.
Okay. Oh, gosh. Did my nephew, your grandson, put a Stegosaurus card in our stack of cards?
So your godson, Carson, my grandson, loves all dinosaurs. And he's good with the language, but he knows the names of all the dinosaurs. So if you showed him that card, he would say Stegosaurus. Of course, the only one he doesn't know is when I asked him, what dinosaur has the best vocabulary? A thesaurus. He didn't get that one.
I don't
will
think so.
Someday. I'll say it enough times.
Jarren Duran.
All right, Jarren Duran, also of the Red Sox. He can really run. Alex Cora, the manager of the Red Sox, once told me he's the best athlete on the field, no matter who else is on the field. He said he eats, he lifts, he plays. That's all he does, is he eats, he lifts, and he plays. That's why Jarren Duran is turning into a really good player.
And that kind of sounds like my brother-in-law right there. He lifts, he plays golf, and he takes care of the kids. All right, and last but not least, a Hall of Famer, George Brett.
All right, George Brett is one of the great hitters I've ever seen. For me, after Mike Schmidt and Eddie Matthews, he's the greatest third baseman ever, and it's a very debatable list, by the way. George Brett still holds the major league record with 6 consecutive 3-hit games. Think about that for a second.
Wow.
6 in a row, 3 or more hits.
All right, It's in the Cards. Now, for those listening or watching, we are coming to you live from our back porch in a West Virginia cabin, and so we're working with what we got here. So let me grab the hat for League in Lids. So I've put every single Major League team in a Lids hat, which, by the way, we might have to double some up because we're going to run out of weeks here pretty soon.
That's quite all right.
And we take them out each week. Dad has to tell a story about it. So let's go. All right, here we go. I got my hat, and let's pull it out. We've got the Blue Jays.
All right, the Blue Jays are in a bit of a slide right now. They're not a very good offensive team, and I don't like their chances of making the playoffs this year unless they do something to go get a couple of hitters to go with, Bo Bichette and Vlad Guerrero Jr. So, of course, my cousin Craig lives in Toronto. He loves the Blue Jays. The Blue Jays began their existence in 1977. They played in this ballpark, which was an old football stadium called Exhibition Stadium. And it was a wonderful day, but they literally had to shovel snow off of the field for the first game ever played at Exhibition Stadium. And the Blue Jays won. Doug Alt hit 2 home runs that day. But amazingly, back then, they didn't sell beer at the ballpark. I think it was just the first full year in Toronto, and the fans who are freezing because it's so cold and it's so festive because it's the first game in the history of Toronto, Major League game, they were chanting throughout the game, "We want beer. We want beer," which I think we've all done that at one point or another.
I have a legitimate question for you. Have you ever had a beer at a baseball game?
Yes, I have, Jeff.
I'm not trying to poke fun or anything, but every time, more than often than not, you're covering a game.
99.9% of the games I've gone to, I've covered. Yes, I went before I became a baseball writer. I went to games and I had a beer or two, but I can count the number of beers I've had at a baseball game on one hand.
Well, next time we go to a game, you and I will have a beer together. In fact, that's actually a really good time to talk about this. We're really excited because our next full episode, you're going to have recorded portions because on June the 2nd, we are going to be at Citizens Bank Park in Philadelphia for the Phillies Lou Gehrig Day, taking on the Cardinals. And Lou Gehrig Day is raising awareness for ALS, which my dad's brother, my uncle, passed away from in the fall. So this will be our family's first Lou Gehrig Day without your brother.
Absolutely, and we will celebrate that and do the best we can and do everything we can to help anyone else that's been through what our family has been through.
Absolutely, and if you have anybody who needs resources, please reach out, greatgameorwhat.com. I will personally put you in touch with people within this community that can help you or your family members out as well. Okay, I've got something new I want to try. We've had too many people chime in and ask, does Tim Kurkjian do Immaculate Grid?
All right, now let's be clear, Jeff. I do not do Immaculate Grid because the pressure is too immense on me. As you know, Jeff, I'm only good at like one thing in the world, and that's like stuff that the Immaculate Grid calls for. So if I screw it up and get one wrong, I'm not sure I would ever forgive myself. Like, this becomes work when I have to get them all right and get some really great scores. So I did it one time. I got 9 right. I didn't even know you're supposed to be more obscure than ever. So,
yeah.
All right.
For those that don't know, there's a rarity score, right? So you could just pick players that match the descriptions or what meet in the grid, right? But the more rare, the better. And we talked to Mike Shore. If you haven't gone back to the Seamhead edition or haven't heard it yet, go listen to that one because it's great. Can we start?
Yes, and let's be clear now, just so no one thinks I'm cheating. I was given 5 minutes to think this through, okay?
Yes.
So I have had 5 minutes to figure out some answers. I hope I've got them right, but let's go.
Yeah, I gave it to him right before we started the podcast, and then we hit record at the very beginning of the show, so it's been, 30-odd minutes, but he hasn't been thinking about it because we've been doing the show. Okay, give me a Guardians and Seattle Mariners player. And keeping in mind that in Immaculate Grid, it could be Guardians or Indians.
Or Indians. Yeah. Okay, well, all right, well, Omar Vizquel has to be, well, he's the most obvious, but I don't care because Omar Vizquel, after Ozzie Smith, is the greatest defensive shortstop I've ever seen. And I've told you this story, Jeff. I actually played catch with with Omar Vizquel once. And he in playing catch with him, he does this sleight of hand thing where it doesn't even appear that the ball goes into his glove. Then it's in his hand and he's throwing back to you. After I finally slow him down and say, Omar, what are you doing? He's deflecting the ball off the heel of his glove. He's catching it right here and throwing it back to me. So Omar Vizquel is my Indian Mariner.
How about Indian or Guardian Pittsburgh Pirate?
Okay, that is Carlos Santana, who's also an Indian or a Guardian Mariner. So he could have been the answer to the first one also.
He could have been.
Carlos Santana is our answer because he's been with a lot of teams, 38 years old.
Isn't he also on your all-musical team?
Yes, he was the catcher, right?
Yeah, he's great. Okay, and on this row, Guardians Astros or Indians Astros.
Buddy Bell is my choice there. He only played, I believe, 1 year with the Astros.
2%.
Craig Biggio told me once. Craig Biggio told me that he learned about what it takes to play in a major league game by playing with Buddy Bell for 1 year. And he said in between games of a doubleheader, Buddy Bell, who's like in the last 2 years of his career, has a cortisone shot in between games. He's sitting in the trainer's room with a needle in his knee so he can go out and play the second game of the doubleheader, and he was nearly 40 years old.
All right, we're moving on to the next row. Threw a no-hitter for the Seattle Mariners.
All right, Randy Johnson's the obvious one, but we're going to go a little more obscure and go Chris Bosio, whose no-hitter was saved by the aforementioned Omar Vizquel, who barehanded the final ball and made a perfect throw to first. As Omar told me, I would have never gotten him if I didn't barehand it. Omar had the greatest barehanded plays I've ever seen.
Threw a no-hitter for the Pirates.
All right, for the Pirates, let's see. All right, Doc Ellis threw the famous no-hitter for the Pirates. I believe it was in 1972. And Doc Ellis claims that he was on LSD when he threw the no-hitter, which I wouldn't even know what LSD is because I get buzzed on 2 Miller Lights. So, yes, he pitched a no-hitter for the Pirates.
All right, let me put it in. Hold on. Sorry. It didn't come up initially, but that's because I forgot to add a K to Doc Ellis. I thought it was D-O-C.
Right.
All right, next up, last but not least on the no-hitter for the Astros.
Well, I think they've had 17 no-hitters, most of them by Nolan Ryan, but that's too easy. So Don Wilson had 2 no-hitters, and Don Wilson pitched in the 60s. Don Wilson threw really, really hard. So these people who say, oh, no one threw hard back then, trust me, Don Wilson was bringing it.
Okay, so I'm going to put in Don Wilson, and while I do that, I want you to give me a minimum of 1 game playing outfield for the Mariners.
Boy, 1 game. There are a million of those guys. So one of my favorite early Mariners was a guy named Dan Meyer. And I remember writing this note in like 1982. He was afraid of heights. So when he stayed in the team hotel, he had to insist that he didn't have a room higher than 3 levels up because he was afraid of heights. And as you know, Jeff, I'm scared to death of heights. I'm not even comfortable being this tall. So.
Which isn't that tall, by the way.
Yes, exactly.
All right, let me put this one in. Dan Meyer.
Meyer.
So he played from 2004 to 2010 because there's 2 Meyers. So, or was it 74 to 85?
Yeah, 74 to 85.
I don't want to get this wrong. 0.2% on that pull.
Well,
and once again, only gave you 5 minutes to do this, and hand to God, I saw it. I made it happen. I forced him to do this because I've been asking him to do Immaculate Grid with me. Pirates playing the outfield minimum 1 game.
All right. Well, I'm not going obscure here. We have to mention Ralph Kiner here because we're also storytellers here, Jeff. And Ralph Kiner is one of the great home run hitters of all time, Hall of Famer, one of the greatest guys I've ever met. And of course, he was a tremendous broadcaster for the Mets for all those years. And the king of the malaprop, occasionally he would get something wrong. So he once called Dan Billardello, backup catcher for several teams, Dan Billardello. He called him Don Bordello on the air.
You said
that was a little embarrassing.
You said it wasn't that obscure. It's 0.7%. So at least
Ralph Kiner.
Yeah,
he hit 50 homers multiple times.
And last but not least, Houston Astros outfielder minimum 1 game.
All right, I did give this 5 minutes of thought. John Paciorek. John Paciorek played in the major leagues for the Astros, and he played one game. He is the older brother of Tom Paciorek, who had a much longer career. John Paciorek played for the Astros. Get this, Jeff. He went 3 for 3 in the only game he ever played in. Then he hurt his back and never played in the major leagues ever again. So he retired with a 1,000 batting average, 3 for 3.
John Paciorek. Let's see. Immaculate Grid. Success. Rarity score 104.
What does that mean?
It's pretty good. That's what that means.
Oh, that's my final score?
That's your final score.
What is good?
That is pretty good. That's really good. You were immaculate.
All right, I'm not doing this anymore. That 5 minutes was torturous for me, and I don't have time to do that.
Right. All right. Well, let's move forward now in the show because we've got a lot more to get to, of course. Thank you for doing Immaculate Grid, Dad. I know you were a little uncomfortable to do that. You do Wordle every day, so I didn't think it would be that big of a deal. But let's get back to what makes this show special this week. It's our Memorial Day episode, and as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, we understand that is all about honoring those who made the ultimate sacrifice for our country, lost their lives to make us free here in the United States. But there's also so many players that have served in military, either during their baseball careers, after, or before.
Yeah, and not just players, Jeff. Great players. Thousands of major league players served our country. Like Warren Spahn is the all-time winningest left-handed pitcher ever with 363 wins. He was on the bridge at Remagen when Allied forces crossed the Rhine for the first time in 1945. That is how involved he was in the entire invasion of Europe. Of course, Ted Williams, one of the great Marine pilots ever, and one of my greatest thrills ever is not just talking to him about hitting, talking to him about his war career and what it was like to fly an airplane for his country. I can't even begin to tell you how passionate he was. He was a true war hero. And Jerry Coleman, another veteran who served, told me the greatest fighter pilot I've ever seen was Ted Williams. That's how good he was. All right, Hank Greenberg was a great Hall of Fame first baseman for the Tigers. He was drafted on May the 7th of 1941. He was making $55,000 a year, went into the Army making $21 per month. He was discharged on December the 5th. And, of course, Pearl Harbor happened on December the 7th, and he re-enlisted right after that, because that's what those players of that time did. And Bob Feller, of course, was a great war hero and one of the greatest pitchers we've ever seen. So for my first book, I called Bob Feller on the phone, and I asked him, because I was writing a book about a chapter about baseball and World War II. And this was the question I asked. I said, Bob, why did you enlist and go fight for our country? And he started screaming at me. He said, we were losing that war. We were getting our asses kicked in the Pacific. And any red-blooded American with a gut in his body would have done exactly what I did. I helped turn that war around. We took back the Pacific. And he said, those are the proudest moments of my entire life, is serving my country. I almost started to cry. He was screaming. He wasn't screaming at me. He was screaming at the world that this was something that had to be done. And at the time, he was the highest paid and the best pitcher in the American League. And he threw it away and said, I'm enlisting, and served our country beautifully.
Bob Feller, Lindsay Berra tells an amazing story about her grandfather, Yogi Berra, and Bob Feller having a run-in together. Something that, and this is rare, I'm going to be honest with you, when we do interviews, I know you had never heard before.
I did not know that.
From your reaction.
Probably should have.
And
right.
You and I both got chills. So that's coming up. Before we get to Lindsay, though, Dad, I think we do this every week. a lineup of players, right? We've done everything from Hall of Fame brothers, right? Brothers that have been in the Hall of Fame. I think that's really important to get to. But also, we did fruit and vegetable team, the all fruit and vegetable team.
I would say this is a little bit more serious.
It is. This is going to be, and Dad, let me know ahead of time, this is the all military major league team.
Jeff, again, there are thousands and thousands of players. So, and to just pick these guys is unfair to everyone else. But I just want to give you the magnitude of the players that served for our country. So Yogi Berra is the catcher, who we mentioned.
Of course.
Hank Greenberg at first base. Jackie Robinson at second base, Hall of Famer Luke Appling at shortstop, Dr. Bobby Brown, my dear friend who went on to become a doctor, Yogi Berra's roommate with the Yankees. They tell the greatest stories ever. In fact, Yogi is apparently reading a comic book while Dr. Brown is reading his medical books in the same room. And after they turn out the lights, Yogi looks at Dr. Bobby Brown and says, How did yours turn out? Like, he was reading a comic book.
He was reading about tuberculosis.
Right. All right, the outfield has so many guys. There are too many to choose, but these are just five outfielders who served. Of course, Ted Williams, Willie Mays, Joe DiMaggio, Stan Musial, Ty Cobb, and we mentioned the pitchers, Warren Spahn and Bob Feller. Those guys are like 10, 12 of the greatest players of all time, and they all served our country, and that's why we're remembering them on Memorial Day.
I hope you all enjoyed time with your family this past weekend. I know we have, but most importantly, we enjoyed our conversation with Lindsay Berra that we're excited to share with you about her grandfather, a Hall of Fame catcher, but also an incredible member of the military who speaked so highly of that time in his life, more important than any of his baseball service. Lindsay Berra joins the show coming up next.
And we are joined by Lindsay Berra, the granddaughter of the great Yogi Berra, one of the greatest catchers of all time. He won more rings, 10, than any player in Major League history, and I believe he's the most beloved figure in the history of baseball. Lindsay, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, thanks so much for having me.
Pleasure.
Right off the bat, Lindsay, how cool was it for you to grow up with not only a grandfather who played Major League Baseball, but a Hall of Famer, and as my dad mentioned, one of the greatest to ever play?
I mean, it's much cooler now looking back in retrospect, because when I was a kid, I had no idea. It was like, I was probably like, I don't know, 10, 11, 12 years old before I even realized he was a famous person. You know, as a kid, I thought Grandpa's job was to manage the Yankees or coach, you know, whatever he happened to be doing at that particular time. And I didn't really think of that job as any different than my friends' grandfathers who were accountants or school bus drivers or, you know, whatever the heck they did. So by the time I was old enough to understand that Grandpa Yogi was also this really famous Yogi Berra guy, it was kind of hard to rationalize the two in my mind. And even now, as a very grown-up person, the Grandpa Yogi's on one side, and that's the guy who, like, you know, watched all the Seinfeld reruns and burned the hot dogs at all of our family barbecues. And then the Yogi Berra guy is the one with the, you know, 10 World Series rings and 18 All-Star games and all that other stuff.
Right. So, Lindsay, what was it like for you wherever you went as you got a little bit older? Someone on a daily basis said, I love your grandfather. He's my favorite player. He's my favorite person ever. What was that like for you?
I don't think people really said that to me as much while he was alive. Like they accosted him for autographs and conversations and hugs and all of those kind of things. But I didn't really start to hear I loved your grandfather so much until he had passed away, and people really started to say what he had meant to them. And it blows my mind and will continue to blow my mind when someone who never met my grandfather, may not have even had a chance to ever see him play in person, comes up to me and says, I loved your grandfather so much. And they mean that word love in the same sense of the word as I mean it. When I say I love my grandfather, it blows my mind that he was able to touch and inspire so many people in that way. And I mean, I don't think I'll ever get used to that.
I had a very brief encounter with your grandfather at the Baseball Hall of Fame, and it was the celebration in the hall. It was Tony Gwynn and Cal Ripken's year, so it was a big, big induction year. And when your grandfather walked into the room, I mean, think about how many players were there at that point. Everybody, all of the Hall of Famers, and the room kind of fell silent for a moment. All of these players, even these other Hall of Famers, were thinking, oh my gosh, Yogi just walked into the room. That is so neat. And on top of his extreme success as a baseball player, you know, this is our Memorial Day episode, and we know Memorial Day is in turn to remember those who had sacrificed their lives and lost their lives in service of our country. But your grandfather served our country as well, and that was a big, big part of who he was as a person.
Yeah, I think it was a tremendous part of who he was as a person. And I also think it played a role in who he became as a baseball player, but I'll go there in a minute. But yeah, so he was a first generation Italian immigrant. He grew up on the Hill in St. Louis, and he loved his country. His parents were incredibly proud to be Americans. And so 1943, he's playing for the Norfolk Tars in the Piedmont League, already a pro baseball contract in his hand. And he turns 18 on May 12th, 1943, and he literally walks from the Norfolk Tars ballpark over to the naval base and says, I enlist, because he felt it was his duty to serve his country. And, you know, only my grandpa Yogi could be bored in basic training. And they asked for volunteers for what they were calling a secret mission. And he goes, oh, that doesn't sound boring. Let's do the secret mission. And he raises his hand. And that turned out to be training for the rocket boats, which was the amphibious assault of Omaha Beach for the D-Day invasion. So he ended up on an LCSS, Landing Craft Support Small, which was a little boat that came off of a bigger boat, which was the USS Bayfield. And he sat on that little boat for 10 days, a couple hundred yards off of Omaha Beach, firing machine gun fire to cover our troops going ashore during the D-Day invasion.
Lindsay, did he ever articulate this with you? Did he ever tell you, let me tell you about the rocket boat or Normandy, or did that never come up?
It wasn't that it didn't come up, because I heard people ask him all the time, and I certainly asked. He just, like a lot of men of that generation, didn't want to go there. And he would tell you that it was like the 4th of July with all the rockets going off in order to get you to move on to the next thing. We all know it was not like the 4th of July. The only times I ever saw or heard or saw him really open up about it was after we first started. So my dad took him to go see, and my uncles took him to see Saving Private Ryan, and he had a little bit of a moment in the movie theater. And then I watched the first episode of Band of Brothers with my dad and my grandpa, and he got real quiet and didn't really articulate a lot of it, but you know, just kind of went kind of inside himself. And then he was much older, and we had an event, a D-Day event at the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center. Tommy Lasorda was there with him, and they were sitting in the front row watching this new PBS footage that they had found of the D-Day invasion. And I was a few rows behind him, and I thought that he had actually fallen asleep. And I went down to tap him on the shoulder to make sure, like, just to wake him up. But he was not asleep. He was just kind of like, he was going like this, and people can't see me, but he was going... He was making this like whistling noise kind of with his eyes closed. And this footage that they had of the PBS in the PBS documentary, you could hear the whistle of the big German 88 gun up in the hills. And that was the whistle. And that was the noise that Grandpa was making. I'm going to cry remembering this. God. And he had just gone back there in his head and just had his eyes closed and was making that whistle. So, you know, he didn't talk about it a lot, but it certainly was in him for sure. And, you know, I say a lot, Grandpa went on to, you know, come home and play for the Yankees and marry my grandmother and live this amazing American life. And I'm sorry, I get emotional talking about it still.
That's all right.
I talk about it all the time because I just think about him. And anyway, I don't think for a second that he ever took a moment of his life for granted, because he saw so many men die in front of him. It was his job to pull the bodies of our fallen servicemen out of the water after the beach had been secured. I don't think that's a experience that leaves you. And I think every day that he was able to play a kid's game for a living, I mean, he just absolutely knew how blessed and lucky he was and would tell anyone who would listen about that fact. And then he becomes known as one of the greatest clutch hitters in the history of baseball. And I know that when he got up with, 2 outs in the bottom of the ninth and runners in scoring position, that was not pressure. When you go through a life or death situation and you know what real pressure is, all the bottom of the ninth with runners on was for Grandpa was opportunity to take advantage of the fact that he was still here when other people were not.
Oh, Lindsay, I'm in tears myself here. So there must have been a time you're talking to somebody about baseball and that person looks at you and goes, well, let me tell you about your dad, your grandfather, the war hero. That must have come up, that from nowhere you hear a story about what he did to serve our country.
It's funny. I actually hear more often that people don't know he served the country. I've had a few run-ins with folks who tell me stories about when Grandpa, after the war, he was at the submarine base in New London, Connecticut, and he was playing for the base team under an assumed name because he wasn't allowed to play because he was a pro. It was like Joe Castano or some weird fake name that he was using to go off the base and play. So like I hear people tell me those stories, which I find, hilarious. But it's funny, more often than not, people remember him as a baseball player. They remember him more for the funny things he said off the field. I do very much believe that his personality and the Yogiisms overshadowed what a tremendous baseball player he was. But there's not a lot of folks who knew that he was in the service and especially not at Omaha Beach on D-Day. And, I was the executive producer of It Ain't Over, which is a documentary about my grandfather that folks can watch on Netflix and Amazon and Apple TV. We're 98% on Rotten Tomatoes, so everyone should watch it.
It's fabulous. I've seen it. Keep going.
So many of those folks who saw the movie came up afterwards or sent me notes on Twitter, Instagram, whatever. I didn't know your grandfather was in the service. I didn't know he was in D-Day. So, maybe it was something that folks knew back in the 50s or something. And then it just kind of forgot. But actually, Grandpa, there was a little bit when Grandpa was first in the big leagues when Bob Feller wouldn't talk to him. And he didn't understand what the problem was because Grandpa, he talked to everybody. And he asked somebody, why doesn't Bob Feller like me, or why doesn't he talk to me? And he goes, oh, he doesn't have respect for people who didn't serve their country. And Grandpa was like, yo, hello, I was there. And then Bob Feller eventually apologized to him, and then they became great friends. So a lot of, even his, his counterparts in Major League Baseball didn't know he was in the service. Grandpa was never one to toot his own horn, and, or to talk about himself at all, be it, World War II or baseball or whatever. You had to really ask him pointed questions to get him to go into detail about anything. So I guess, that's what happened with Bob Feller too.
Right. Lindsay, with the 10 rings and the 3 MVPs and the unbelievable performance on the baseball field, is it clear to you still if he had to choose one or the other, helping to serve his country or be a great baseball player, there might not even be a choice there?
No, I think the duty would always have come first. That he was so proud to be an American and knew that it was his job to serve his country. And I think that baseball, he never considered baseball work, so I feel like he would have put the service ahead of the baseball, but he also knew how lucky he was to be able to play baseball. And he loved it with every fiber of his being for, as long as he was on planet Earth, right? He started with the Yankees in 1946. And we had him at Yankee Stadium in 2015. I mean, that's an incredible run with Major League Baseball.
With a storied, amazing organization. Now, Lindsay, my grandfather, who you can actually see in this photo, it's a chalk photo done by my mom's mom of my dad's dad and myself. And, he served. And I feel you hit on it perfectly. Men of that generation, it just wasn't like, let me tell you what happened back in 1943. That just wasn't it. It was just a part of them. It was a part of what the country was doing. And to hear how that meant more to him than his storied baseball career because he got to serve the country that he loves so much, it's just so fitting and so beautiful for a day like today.
I also think that it was so the norm back then. I mean, there was the draft. Grandpa enlisted before he was drafted, but most men of a certain age were drafted into World War II. And it was such a common experience with the folks of that generation. So even though you had your own story, it was so like everybody else's story that maybe you didn't feel like you needed to tell it, right? And then there was the other aspect of you came home when all these other guys didn't, and you're telling stories around people who lost family members and loved ones, and there was probably a big part of my grandpa that didn't want to gloat for having survived, right?
Right. Will this anniversary of D-Day, another big anniversary, mean even more, say, for you?
Yeah, we have 60th anniversary coming up. It's amazing. We are planning like a day of programming at the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center to commemorate it. I feel like it means a lot to me every year since Grandpa has passed, and since we're losing more and more of those veterans. I think we have a gentleman coming to the museum, and he's 100 years old, and there's just not going to be many more of those folks around for much longer. So yeah, I don't want that to be forgotten. I love that you guys are talking about it. I love that at the museum we tell Grandpa's story as a way of keeping D-Day in everybody's memory. And I think it's really important that we remember, the price we pay to live freely in this country.
Right. Lindsay, last one for me. If you were to meet, I'm sure it's happened, a young player today recognizes your last name and says, tell me about Yogi Berra, what would be the first thing that you would tell a young baseball player about your grandfather?
Oh my God, I would probably get like diarrhea of the mouth and just everything would fall out, right? Because I love to tell them that, before he was a ball player, he was on Omaha Beach. I mean, that's important. But like my favorite there's two favorite stats that I like to share with the young guys. 1950, 656 plate appearances, 597 at-bats. He hit 322, 124 RBIs, 28 home runs, and struck out 12 times in 656 plate appearances. So, like, I physical challenge anybody to come even remotely close to doing that in a full season. And then the other is that...
They can't do that in a full week, Lindsay, these days.
Or a weekend.
Yes.
Yeah, one series.
And then the other is that he caught both ends of double headers 117 times in his career. Wow. So 18 innings, 117 times. And I physical challenge any big league catcher to do that just once and tell me how it feels to walk down the stairs the next day. And then also remember that you didn't do it in August in a wool suit.
Right. Well, my last thing on Yogi was he looked at me once and told me, I pulled it out of him. He said, I drove in 23 runs in a doubleheader in the minor leagues. 23 runs. I said, what? Yogi, how can that happen? He goes, I only hit one homer. He said, but I can't imitate your grandfather. He said, but every time it came up, the bases were loaded. And then he cleared the bases 6 times in one game, in one doubleheader.
When my grandparents met, they met at Biggie's on the Hill in St. Louis, which was Stan Musial's restaurant. And my grandmother wouldn't go out with him at first because she thought he was married, all these other reasons. But the fact that he had driven in those 23 runs, someone told her that, and she thought that he might have a chance as a ball player. It was one of the things that got him to take her seriously.
Oh, that is a great story. Lindsay, we can't thank you enough for joining us, honoring your grandfather's memory. Tell us a little bit about the mission of the Yogi Berra Museum and Learning Center and what one can get if they make it out there, and tell people about it.
So it's a great place. It's on the campus of Montclair State University in Little Falls, New Jersey. You can take the train right out from the city, or it's an easy Uber from Manhattan. You get to see a lot of glittery things, MVP flags. We have all 27 Yankees World Series rings. There's a lot of cool memorabilia, but the Learning Center part was really what was most important to my grandfather. He quit school in the 8th grade, and he was always very self-conscious of that fact. But when he made the big leagues, by the time he had once he had enough money to do so, he established a scholarship fund at Columbia University that still exists today. And he wanted the Learning Center part to kind of trump the museum part of the museum. We have we do educational programs for kids, character education programs, STEM education, teaching science and math through baseball. We had an exhibit on the Negro Leagues that is now kind of memorialized in a capsule that teaches the history of racism in the country through the history of racism in sports. We have a spoken word capsule on the Yogiisms, women in sports. A capsule right now. We just opened a COVID exhibit, baseball and COVID. But the idea is really to just pass on Grandpa's values of inclusion and excellence and leadership and treating people with respect to the next generation of both baseball fans and non-baseball fans. Because we have a lot of kids who come in who are not baseball fans, but they learn something and can just have something to look up to and emulate in the way that my grandfather lived his life. So that's what we do there.
Lindsay, it's so fitting that his war career was more important than his baseball career. And at the museum of his life and career, the education part of it is more important to him than the actual museum. It's so fitting.
Right. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us. You made us laugh and you made us cry today. That's really, really special. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You guys should come visit the museum too, Jeff. Come anytime. Come from Philly.
Thank you so much to Lindsay Berra for joining our Memorial Day episode. And if you got some time to spend with your friends and family, we did too. And we recorded this podcast with the help of these amazing family. We've got my mom, Kathy. Say hi to the people.
Hi, people.
There you go. We've got my wife, Emily.
Hello.
And our daughter, McKinley. There you go. Good. Our dog, Ranger. And then, Dad, who do you have over there?
I've got our daughter, Kelly, and her husband, Mark, and Carson, our grandson.
He's a dog.
And Emma, our granddaughter.
Emma, the granddaughter. Yeah, and this is our family. And so from our family to yours, a happy Memorial Day weekend. And thank you for always being part of our family.